Madison was a girl who carried the world on her shoulders, though no one would know it by just looking at her. With a disability that made even the simplest tasks a challenge, she still found beauty in the small things: flowers blooming outside her window, the sun shining through the trees, and the sound of birds singing as she sat in her favorite chair by the window. Despite her physical limitations, her heart was free, and she reveled in the joy of life's little victories. Her parents, fully aware of the difficulties Madison faced, made sure their home was a safe haven, a place where she could just be herself without fear or judgment. They made it their mission to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, and their home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, provided them with the peace they cherished. The neighborhood, too, seemed like a haven. The streets were lined with well-kept lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and brightly painted houses that all blended together into a picturesque suburban paradise. People smiled as they passed each other, and there was an unspoken rule about respecting one another's privacy. It was the type of place where families could settle down, grow roots, and feel safe. But like many seemingly perfect places, there was an undercurrent of tension. Beneath the surface, there was an invisible force that shaped the lives of those who lived there: the Homeowners Association, or HOA. The HOA was a group of residents tasked with keeping the neighborhood looking pristine and orderly. At its best, the HOA was a community-driven organization that helped ensure things ran smoothly. But at its worst, it became an overbearing presence, casting its shadow over every homeowner's decisions. And at the helm of this authority was Karen, a woman whose obsession with rules and control seemed to seep into every aspect of her life. Her lawn was always meticulously manicured, her flowers arranged just so, and her mailbox never out of place. Karen prided herself on perfection, believing that the slightest deviation from her standards was a threat to the community's well-being. To the outside world, Karen appeared harmless. She was friendly, with a smile that could light up the room, and her presence was often seen at neighborhood meetings, offering unsolicited advice on everything from gardening to trash bins. However, those who had spent more time with her knew that her kindness had a sharp edge. She had a tendency to hold grudges, and her version of community spirit meant enforcing rules with an iron fist. Karen had a way of making people feel like they were constantly being judged, and nothing was ever good enough for her. Madison's family had always lived under the radar, avoiding any unnecessary run-ins with Karen. They respected the HOA's rules, did what they were told, and kept their heads down. But it didn't take long for Madison's family to notice Karen's increasing scrutiny. A missing flower pot on the porch became an issue. The occasional toys left in the front yard, nothing that would disrupt the neighborhood's aesthetic, were noticed. Karen, it seemed, was always watching, and Madison, in her innocence, had no idea how her simple existence was about to become the focus of Karen's intense gaze. The storm was coming, though no one saw it yet. It was the kind of tension that builds slowly without warning. At first, it was small things: a note left on the door about an overgrown bush or a misplaced recycling bin. But soon, Karen's criticisms would grow more personal. She didn't like the way Madison's shoes didn't match the HOA's unwritten dress code. She didn't like the way Madison's wheelchair took up too much space on the sidewalk, even though there was plenty of room for others to pass. It wasn't long before Karen's little comments became full-blown complaints, and it became clear that she was targeting Madison and her family. Madison's parents didn't want to believe it at first. After all, Karen had always been polite, even if a bit too involved. But they couldn't ignore the subtle signs anymore. The HOA had always been an unspoken presence in their lives, but now it was becoming a constant source of anxiety. What had started as an innocent request to adjust a flower pot here or a piece of furniture there was slowly turning into something more sinister. And as the tension simmered beneath the surface, Madison remained blissfully unaware. She continued to enjoy her days as best as she could, never imagining that the safe and peaceful neighborhood she loved was about to turn into a battlefield. The calm before the storm was, for Madison, a time of blissful ignorance. For her parents, it was a time of quiet unease, knowing that something was shifting in the air. They had no idea how far Karen's control would stretch or how quickly their lives would spiral into chaos. But they would soon find out. The storm, although still distant, was gaining strength, and it was headed straight for them. It was a warm Saturday morning when the storm began to take shape. Madison woke up early as she always did to the soft golden rays of sunlight creeping through her window. She stretched, her limbs stiff from the day before, but there was always something comforting about starting her day with a familiar routine. Today, she decided she would spend some time in the garden, her favorite place to be. She loved the feeling of the sun on her face, the cool breeze that rustled the leaves, and the bright colors of the flowers that her parents had so carefully planted for her enjoyment. Her parents, still sleepy, let her roam the yard on her own. They trusted her. After all, she was never far from the house and was well accustomed to the layout of the garden. She made her way outside in her usual clothes, comfortable shoes, and a soft, cotton dress that allowed her to move freely. The shoes were simple, easy to slip on, and not particularly fashionable, but Madison didn't care about such things. She wasn't interested in trends or rules. She was just living in the moment, enjoying the simplicity of her world. Unbeknownst to her, those shoes would be the catalyst for everything that was about to happen. As Madison walked across the yard, her hands brushing the leaves of the plants, she could hear the familiar hum of Karen's lawnmower in the distance. It was a sound that Madison had always associated with peace and order in the neighborhood. However, today, the hum of the mower had a different tone. There was an edge to it, a sense of watchfulness. Karen had always kept to herself, but today, she seemed to be more observant than usual, her gaze lingering longer than normal as she worked in her own yard. When Madison's parents came outside to check on her, they noticed the change in the air. It was subtle, but the tension was palpable. They could see Karen standing in her yard, watching from a distance, her eyes scanning every inch of a neighborhood as if she were looking for something to critique. Her gaze shifted to Madison's shoes, and a small frown creased her forehead. It was as if Karen had found a reason to disapprove, even before speaking a word. Madison's mother, Maria, noticed Karen's gaze and immediately felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to maintain harmony, but Karen's scrutiny was becoming too much to ignore. Maria had heard the whispers, Karen's complaints about other families, her judgments about the way people maintain their homes, and now it seemed her critical eye had fallen on them. "What's wrong with her shoes?" Maria asked softly as she took Madison's hand, gently steering her away from the garden. "I don't know," Madison replied, looking down at her shoes, her innocent voice tinged with confusion. "They're just my shoes." "Why?" Her mother gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's nothing, sweetie. Let's just go inside for now." But Karen had already made up her mind. Later that afternoon, when the day was still warm and the sun hung low in the sky, there came a knock on the door. Maria opened it to find Karen standing there, her usual smile replaced by a stern expression. In her hand, she held a folded piece of paper, which she thrust into Maria's hands without a word. Maria unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words written in the HOA's formal tone. "It has come to our attention that the shoes worn by your daughter, Madison, do not meet the HOA's guidelines for appropriate attire while outside. This is a violation of neighborhood standards. Please address this matter immediately." The words hit Maria like a slap in the face. Her daughter, her beautiful, brave daughter, was being reprimanded for the shoes she wore. It was ridiculous. It was petty. And yet there it was in black and white. Karen stood there, waiting, her eyes piercing through Maria as though daring her to object. "It's important that we all follow the rules," Karen said coolly, her voice dripping with condescension. "We can't have one person making the neighborhood look bad." Maria's heart raced, her fists clenching at her sides. She wanted to scream, to tell Karen just how absurd this was, but she knew that would only make matters worse. The HOA had power, and challenging it could lead to more trouble than they could handle. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Karen. Maria said, her voice tight with restraint. "We'll make sure Madison follows the guidelines from now on." Karen's smile returned, though it lacked any warmth. "I'm sure you will," she said before turning on her heel and walking away. Inside, Maria's hands trembled as she closed the door. She could feel the weight of the situation sinking in, her blood boiling with frustration. All of this over a pair of shoes. How had it come to this? How had the peace they had fought so hard for in their little home turned into a battleground over such trivialities? But the real pain, the real hurt, wasn't in the shoes. It was in the way Madison was treated. It was the knowledge that her daughter, who already faced daily challenges just to be herself, was now being singled out for something as meaningless as footwear. Maria tried to hide her feelings, but Madison saw through her calm facade. She saw the hurt in her mother's eyes, and her heart ached with the thought that her mere existence had caused such a rift in their quiet, peaceful life. In the days that followed, Karen's eyes never stopped watching. Every movement in their yard, every step Madison took was scrutinized, but the real storm had yet to arrive. This small mistake, this minor infraction, was only the beginning of a series of events that would forever change the course of their lives. The HOA's quiet power had now turned into a weapon, and Karen was ready to wield it. The days that followed Karen's initial complaint were filled with tension. Madison's parents tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but they both felt the weight of the situation looming over them. Every time they stepped outside, they couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching. Every little detail in their yard seemed scrutinized, from the placement of the garden gnomes to the alignment of the flower pots. It was as if their peaceful life was being slowly chipped away, piece by piece, by a neighbor who had made it her mission to ensure that everyone lived according to her rigid standards. Maria and her husband, David, discussed the situation at length late one night when the house was quiet and Madison was already asleep. They tried to reason with each other, to figure out how to approach the problem without escalating it further. But as they spoke, it became clear that the problem wasn't just about the shoes anymore. It was about Karen's obsession with control. It was about her need to make everyone conform to her idea of what was proper, regardless of how it made others feel. And it was about Madison, who had been caught in the crossfire of someone's need for power. "We can't keep letting her push us around like this," David said, his voice tight with frustration. "This is our home, our daughter. We shouldn't have to live in fear of Karen's next complaint." "I know," Maria replied, her voice wavering. "But if we go against her, the HOA could make things worse for us. We could get fined. They could even try to take legal action. I don't want to make it harder. For Madison." David looked at his wife, his heart aching for her. He knew how much it hurt her to see Madison treated this way, but he also knew that they couldn't just roll over. They couldn't let Karen and the HOA dictate how they live their lives. "I don't want to make things harder either," David said, "but we can't let Karen get away with this. We have to stand up for her. For all of us." The conversation left them both feeling uneasy. It was clear they were at a crossroads. They had to decide whether to confront Karen head-on or keep quiet and hope it would blow over. But deep down, they both knew that silence wasn't an option anymore. The issue was too personal, too close to home. They couldn't allow their daughter to be treated as though she were a problem to be fixed, just because she didn't fit into Karen's narrow view of the world. The next morning, as Madison played quietly in the living room, her parents discussed their plan. They decided it was time to confront Karen directly. They had to make it clear that they wouldn't tolerate her behavior any longer. They couldn't allow her to use the HOA as a tool for bullying. The fear of retaliation was still there, but it was outweighed by the need to protect Madison, to show her that they would always stand up for her. Later that afternoon, Karen came to the door again, her face as pleasant as ever, but there was something cold in her eyes. She was holding another letter from the HOA, and the smile she flashed was more calculated than friendly. "This is your final warning," Karen said, handing over the letter without a word of greeting. "It's about Madison's shoes again. The HOA has decided that unless you adhere to the guidelines, further action will be taken. Maria took the letter with a steady hand, but her heart pounded in her chest. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the words on the paper still stung. The letter outlined the fines they would face if Madison continued to wear inappropriate footwear in the yard, and it also mentioned other vague violations that were completely unfounded. It was clear that this was no longer about shoes. It was a deliberate attempt to break them down, to show them that Karen was in control. David stepped forward, his jaw set in determination. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly. "Madison is a child. She's disabled, and she has every right to wear whatever makes her comfortable. You can't keep doing this." Karen's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she processed David's words. "I'm just following the rules," she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness. "Rules are there for a reason. You can't expect to live in this neighborhood without respecting the standards. If you want to continue living here, you'll have to follow them." David's patience snapped. "You don't get to dictate what's right for my daughter. She's not some rule to be followed. She's a person. And if you can't see that, then you're the one who doesn't belong here." Karen stiffened, her posture changing from defensive to confrontational. "I suggest you watch your tone," she said, her voice now laced with a threat. "The HOA has a lot of influence. If you don't want things to get worse, I suggest you stop fighting this. You're only making it harder on yourselves." Maria stepped forward, her own voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "We're not going to let you treat our daughter like this anymore. We'll take this to the HOA board if we have to. You can't just keep bullying us." For a brief moment, the two women locked eyes. The tension was thick, and the words left a bitter taste in Maria's mouth. She didn't want to make an enemy of Karen, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. Not when it came to Madison. Karen's smile returned, but it was colder now, more predatory. "You've been warned," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Don't say, 'I didn't give you a chance.'" With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Maria and David standing on the porch, hearts racing and minds reeling. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. They had made their stand, but the battle had only just begun. As the door closed behind them, Maria and David exchanged a look of determination. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The HOA was no longer just a distant entity, it was now their adversary. And they would fight for their daughter, no matter what it took. The tension in the house had never been this thick. The confrontation with Karen had left Madison's parents rattled, but their resolve remained. They knew they couldn't let this go any longer. It wasn't just about the shoes or the HOA's ridiculous rules. It was about Madison's dignity, her rights as a child, and her right to simply exist without being judged or bullied. But as the days dragged on, it became increasingly clear that Karen wasn't going to back down. She had shown them her cards, and now it was their move. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that Karen had one more trick up her sleeve, one that would change everything. It started out like any other day. Madison was outside in the garden, sitting in her favorite spot by the flowers, her hand gently brushing the petals. The sky was a pale blue, and the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Her parents were inside, discussing the situation, trying to come up with a plan for the next steps. They had decided to file a formal complaint with the HOA board, and hopefully that would put an end to Karen's reign of terror. But little did they know, Karen had already anticipated this move. At around noon, Madison's mother Maria went to check on her. She walked into the garden, a gentle smile on her face, but her expression faltered when she saw that Madison was no longer in her usual spot. A sense of unease spread through her as she scanned the yard. Madison wasn't anywhere to be seen. Maria called out her daughter's name, but there was no answer. Panic started to set in as she quickly searched the house, hoping Madison had just wandered inside. But as she reached the front door and looked out onto the street, she realized something was terribly wrong. The garage door was closed. Normally, it wouldn't be cause for concern. It was the middle of the day, after all, and the door was usually shut when no one was home. but something about it felt off, like a warning bell ringing in the distance. Maria's heart started to race as she approached the garage, knocking softly on the door. "Madison," she called, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you in there?" There was no reply. Panic flared. Her mind raced with terrible thoughts. What if something had happened? What if, just what if, Karen had done something to their daughter? Maria's hand shook as she reached for the door handle, but before she could open it, the door creaked open on its own. What she saw sent a cold shiver down her spine. Madison was inside the garage, sitting on the cold concrete floor. She was alone, her face pale, her body trembling slightly from the chill in the air. She looked up at Maria with wide, frightened eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, I don't understand. Why am I in here?" Maria's breath caught in her throat as she rushed forward to kneel beside her daughter. "Madison, what happened? Why are you in the garage?" Madison's small voice trembled as she explained. "Karen, she came by and said I had to stay here. She said I wasn't allowed out until I followed the rules. She locked the door, Mom." Her voice cracked. "She said I didn't listen to her before." Maria's blood ran cold as she listened to her daughter's words. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a sickening realization that their lives had just been turned upside down by someone who was supposed to be their neighbor, someone who was supposed to care. Karen's cruelty was unimaginable, and yet there it was right before her eyes. Maria quickly helped Madison to her feet, her voice shaky but firm as she tried to comfort her. "We're going to get you out of here, Madison. We're going to make this right." But as she turned to leave the garage, the door wouldn't budge. She tried again, her strength failing to move the heavy door. Panic set in once more as she realized that Karen had locked it from the outside, trapping them inside. The realization hit hard, like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a minor dispute. This was something far worse. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce some arbitrary rules anymore. She was trying to break them, to control them, and to make their lives unbearable. Maria's first instinct was to call David, but her phone was in the house, and she had no way of getting to it. Time seemed to stretch as she tried every possible way to open the door, but nothing worked. Meanwhile, Madison sat on the floor, her fear palpable, her small hands clutching her knees as she looked up at her mother. "Mom, what's going to happen? Why won't she let me go?" Maria's heart ached as she held her daughter close. She didn't have an answer for her. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain to Madison that someone they had trusted had just violated them in the worst possible way? How could she reassure her that everything would be okay when she didn't even know how to fix this herself? Outside the garage, Karen watched from the safety of her porch, her face a twisted mixture of satisfaction and amusement. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew she had the power now. She had seen Madison's family fight back, but in that moment, it felt like she had won. It wasn't about shoes anymore. It was about asserting control, about making them bow to her demands. But Karen didn't know what was about to happen. She didn't know the depth of resolve that Madison's parent had. She didn't know that they were willing to go to any lengths to protect their daughter. What Karen thought was a victory was, in reality, the beginning of the family's fight back, a fight that would bring the full force of their love for Madison and their determination to stand against tyranny. Madison's parents may have been trapped for the moment, but they were not defeated. They would find a way to break free from Karen's grip, and when they did, there would be no going back. The hours dragged on in the cold, dimly lit garage. Maria and Madison sat huddled together, trying to keep warm, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. The garage door, stubbornly locked, trapped them in a suffocating silence. Maria's mind raced, but her thoughts were scattered, unable to focus. She couldn't understand how it had come to this, how someone could treat her daughter this way, how Karen could lock them in like this without a second thought. "Mom, I'm scared," Madison whispered, her voice barely audible. Her words cut through Maria's heart like a knife. There was a childlike innocence in Madison's tone, an innocence that had been betrayed in the worst way. She was vulnerable, helpless, and yet in the face of it all, still trying to be strong. "I know, sweetheart," Maria replied, her voice trembling as she brushed a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face. "But we'll be okay. We just need to stay calm and wait. Your dad will figure this out. We'll be out of here soon." But as the minutes turned into hours, Maria could feel the pressure mounting. Her promise to Madison felt hollow. How could she protect her daughter when they were both trapped in this place, at the mercy of a woman who seemed intent on ruining their lives? Outside the garage, the world continued as it always had. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful even, with no sign of a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Karen remained at her house, watching from her window, the sense of control and satisfaction radiating from her. She had done it. She had broken them. At least, that's what she thought. The longer Maria and Madison stayed locked away, the more she felt she had won. But Karen didn't know the strength of the bond between a mother and her child. She didn't know how far Maria and David would go to protect their daughter, to give her the life she deserved, one free of fear, one where she could simply be herself without being judged or punished for things she couldn't control. Karen thought she had power, but she was mistaken. Inside the garage, Maria struggled to keep her composure. She had to be strong for Madison. The longer they stayed there, the more her anxiety grew. She couldn't help but wonder what Karen was planning next. Would she escalate things further? What if this was only the beginning of something much worse? The unknown was terrifying, and the cold concrete beneath them only made the situation feel even more dire. As the night stretched on, the shadows grew deeper, and the air in the garage grew colder. Maria tried to distract Madison, telling her stories about happier times, about the places they would go when they got out of there, about the friends they would visit, and the fun they would have. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the heaviness of the situation weighing down on her. How could she promise things she wasn't sure she could deliver? Madison's eyes grew heavy with exhaustion, but she fought it. She didn't want to fall asleep in this cold, dark place. Her mind, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, was still filled with confusion and fear. She wanted to believe her mother, wanted to trust that everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew that nothing was okay. They had been trapped by someone they once considered just another neighbor. And now they were alone, alone in the dark, alone in the silence, and alone in the face of an enemy they hadn't expected. Hours passed, and soon the silence in the garage became unbearable. Maria could hear the soft sounds of Madison's breathing, a comforting rhythm that reminded her that despite everything, her daughter was still here, still safe. But the fear never fully left. It lingered in the back of her mind, threatening to consume her. At one point, Maria tried again to open the garage door, her hands shaking with frustration. She pulled on the handle, twisting and pushing, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. She thought about breaking the window, but the thought of doing something that could hurt Madison made her hesitate. They were trapped, helpless, and it felt like there was no way out. Madison looked up at her mother, her face pale and tired. But there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope. "Mom, do you think Dad's coming for us?" Maria forced a smile, though it felt like her heart was breaking. "Of course he is, sweetheart. Your dad is the strongest person I know. He's going to figure this out. We just have to wait a little longer." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in. They had tried everything, and still they were stuck. What if no one was coming to help them? What if this was their life, now, locked away in a garage with no way out? Madison, sensing her mother's distress, reached out and took her hand. "We're going to be okay, right, Mom? You promised." Maria squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to hold on to the promise she had made. She wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but deep down, she knew that things were far from simple. Karen's grip on them was tightening, and Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker path. The garage grew colder as the night wore on, and Maria held Madison close, trying to offer what comfort she could. She had no answers, no way to fix this, but she couldn't give up. She couldn't let Karen win. Not after everything they had been through. Not when they had come so far. As Madison's eyes fluttered closed, Maria whispered a silent vow. She would get her daughter out of this. She would find a way to end this nightmare, no matter what it took. The storm might have arrived, but Maria would fight until the very end to protect her daughter. And so, the long night continued with the cold garage as their prison and the darkness outside serving as a reminder that the battle was far from over. The night seemed to stretch on forever, an agonizing eternity of silence and uncertainty. As Madison slept fitfully in her mother's arms, Maria kept her eyes trained on the locked garage door, willing it to somehow open, willing herself to find a way out of this nightmare. The chill in the air had settled deep into her bones, but the cold was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil that gnawed at her. Every moment they spent in that garage, alone and trapped, was a moment closer to the breaking point. But Maria refused to break. She couldn't afford to. Not for Madison, not when her daughter was depending on her for safety and reassurance. Despite the physical exhaustion, despite the gnawing fear, Maria kept a strong, steady voice whenever Madison stirred, keeping the pretense of calm even when her own world was falling apart. Time seemed to blur together, the minutes stretching into hours until finally the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the small cracks in the garage. Madison stirred, waking from her restless slumber, and her first instinct was to look at her mother with those wide, trusting eyes. Maria's heart ached as she smiled at her daughter, brushing a few stray locks of hair from her face. "Good morning, sweetie," Maria whispered, trying to sound more cheerful than she felt. Madison blinked, still groggy, but her gaze flicked toward the locked door. "Are we going home now, Mom?" Maria's throat tightened. She had no answer for her daughter. She wanted to tell her that everything was going to be okay, that they were going to be free soon, but the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. They had no way out. She had no way to get to David. The helplessness was overwhelming. "We'll get out of here, I promise," Maria said, her voice catching. But inside, she was losing her resolve. She had always been the one who held everything together for Madison, the one who kept the family afloat in times of crisis. But this felt different. This felt like a battle she might not be able to win. The truth was, Maria could feel herself unraveling. She had fought for so long, had stayed strong for so many years. But now the weight of everything, the pressure of dealing with the HOA, the cruelty of Karen, and the fear for her daughter, was beginning to take its toll. The exhaustion was creeping in, and she knew that they couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. And then, in the midst of the rising panic, the door to the garage rattled. Maria's heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to her feet, her breath catching as she raced toward the door. The sound of footsteps on the gravel outside was unmistakable. David. Her heart soared with relief at the thought of him coming to rescue them. But before she could call out to him, the door was pushed open with a loud creak. It wasn't David. Standing in the doorway was Karen, her cold, calculating eyes meeting Maria's gaze. Behind her, the sunlight illuminated the woman's expression, but there was no warmth in it, only a look of triumph, as though she had just completed some grand victory. Maria's pulse quickened. Anger surged through her like wildfire. This was it. This was the moment she had feared, and yet had known deep down would come. She stood tall, her back straightening with a strength that she hadn't realized she still had. "What are you doing here?" Maria's voice was low, a warning laced within it. "What do you want from us, Karen?" Karen stepped inside, her smile tight and patronizing. "I'm here to end this little charade," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You really thought you could just defy the HOA and get away with it? You thought you could break the rules and not face the consequences?" Maria's breath caught in her throat. "This is beyond the rules. You can't do this to my daughter. You can't treat us like this." "Oh, I'm not treating you any worse than you deserve," Karen replied, her eyes flickering with a cruel gleam. "You've been breaking the rules for too long. It's time someone taught you a lesson. And your daughter, well, she's not exactly an innocent bystander, is she?" The venom in Karen's words hit Maria like a punch to the gut. She wanted to scream, to shout, to tell Karen how utterly wrong she was, but something inside her snapped, something darker than rage. She was done with this. She was done with letting Karen win. "This is where you're wrong, Karen," Maria said, her voice hardening. "You think you have control over us. You think you can break us. But you can't. Not anymore." Karen's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice now laced with curiosity, though the edge of arrogance still remained. Maria took a deep breath, every word she spoke like a defiance. "You've made a huge mistake, Karen. You've crossed a line, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. You might have power in this neighborhood, but you don't have power over me. Not anymore." For the first time since entering the garage, Karen's expression changed. She seemed to sense the shift in the air, the realization that Maria wasn't intimidated, that she wasn't going to back down. Maria stepped closer to Karen, her voice now stronger, filled with the fire of a mother fighting for a child. "We're done with you. We're done being afraid. We're done being silenced." The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, the silence that followed deafening. Karen's eyes flickered for a moment, uncertainty creeping into her expression before she turned on her heel and stormed out of the garage without another word. Maria stood there, breathless, her heart pounding. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first step toward regaining control. As the door slammed behind Karen, Maria turned to Madison, who had been watching the exchange silently from the corner of the garage. Madison's face was pale, but her eyes, those eyes, were filled with something Maria hadn't seen in a while. "Hope, are we going to be okay? Now, Mom?" Madison asked quietly, her voice filled with that same innocence that had gotten her caught in the first place. Maria knelt down in front of her daughter, her eyes softening as she cupped Madison's face in her hands. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going to be okay. We're going to fight and we're going to win." The breaking point had come, but from here, there was no turning back. This fight was far from over, and Maria was ready to face it head on, no matter what it took. The days following the confrontation with Karen were filled with uncertainty, but also a renewed sense of determination. Maria had no illusions about what was to come. Karen's anger hadn't been vanquished by a simple argument. Instead, the confrontation had ignited something much bigger, a battle that would require everything Maria and David had to give. But for the first time in weeks, Maria felt a spark of hope. They had pushed back, shown their strength, and for the first time in a long while, Karen didn't have the upper hand. David had finally made it to the garage that morning, his face filled with relief when he saw his family safe. He had been frantic, calling around, trying to figure out where they were. When he saw the state of the garage and realized what had happened, his heart broke for Madison. No child, let alone one with special needs, should ever have to face something like that. But they were safe now, and David was more determined than ever to end the nightmare Karen had started. As they sat in the kitchen, trying to regroup and plan their next steps, Maria felt a familiar surge of strength. They had been backed into a corner. But now they were fighting for their daughter, not just for Madison's well-being, but for the kind of life she deserved. A life free from judgment, free from harassment, and free from fear. "I think we need to go to the HOA board," David said, breaking the silence. "We need to put an end to this." Maria nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. For far too long, the HOA had been a shadow hanging over their lives. It had always been there, lurking, setting rules that made no sense, enforcing standards that no one could live up to. But now it had crossed a line. They couldn't just sit back and let it continue. It was time to expose Karen for what she was: a bully, a manipulator, and a threat to everything they valued. "We need to make sure we have everything," Maria said, her voice steady. "Proof of what happened. And witnesses. We can't just go in there and tell our story. We need to show them exactly what Karen's been doing." David stood up, his eyes filled with determination. "I'll take care of the paperwork. I'll gather everything. You make sure Madison's okay. We'll get this out in the open. We'll show everyone the truth." It was the first real plan they had in days, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Maria felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight. She and David were in this together, and they weren't backing down. The next day, they went to the HOA meeting. They were nervous, but they knew they couldn't back out now. This was it, the moment where they would take back control. When they walked into the meeting room, the familiar faces of the HOA board members greeted them, but Karen wasn't there. That didn't surprise Maria. She knew Karen would try to keep herself as far from the situation as possible. But that didn't matter. It didn't change the facts. David stepped forward, his voice calm but firm as he began presenting their case. He explained how Karen had singled out Madison for her disability, how she had locked them in the garage, and how she had made their lives miserable for weeks. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told them everything, how the HOA's rules were being used as weapons, and how Karen had taken it too far. He made sure to point out that Madison, as a disabled child, deserved more respect than Karen had shown her. They had a right to live in peace, just like everyone else. As David spoke, Maria could feel the weight of the moment. She was telling the truth, and the truth had a way of cutting through the noise. The room was silent as David continued. The board members, for the most part, listened intently, their faces neutral. But Maria noticed something in their eyes, something she hadn't seen before. It was doubt. They were starting to see that maybe Karen's behavior wasn't as harmless as they had once thought. When David finished, he stepped back and gave Maria the floor. She had been nervous to speak, but now, with the support of her husband and the weight of their shared experience, she stood tall. "I want to make it clear," Maria began, her voice shaking slightly but full of conviction, "that this isn't just about shoes or some small infraction. This is about my daughter's safety. This is about her dignity. No child, no person should ever be made to feel like they don't belong because of something they can't control. What Karen did was cruel. She locked my daughter in a garage like she was some kind of prisoner. And for what? Because she didn't follow a rule that's based on nothing but personal preference." Maria paused for a moment, making sure every person in the room heard her words. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for respect, for fairness. We are asking for the right to live without being harassed by someone who thinks she can control everyone's lives." The room was silent after she finished, but this time it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of indifference. It was the silence of reflection. Maria knew they were hearing her. One of the board members, a man in his late 40s, cleared his throat before speaking. "Thank you, Maria, for sharing your story. We take these matters seriously. We'll investigate what has happened and take appropriate action." For the first time in weeks, Maria felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet, but this was the first step. The board wasn't dismissing their concerns. They weren't brushing them off as just another complaint. They were listening, and they were promising to take action. As they left the meeting, David squeezed Maria's hand, a smile creeping onto his face. "We did it," he said softly. "We've got a real chance to fix this." Maria smiled back, but there was still a fire in her eyes. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. We'll make sure of that." And she was right. The tide was turning. The battle wasn't over, but it was now a fight they could win. They had exposed the truth, and Karen's days of ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist were numbered. It was just a matter of time before justice prevailed, and they could finally live in peace. The waiting was the hardest part. After the HOA meeting, Maria and David felt the relief of knowing that their voices had been heard, but the uncertainty lingered like a cloud overhead. The board had promised to investigate Karen's behavior, but in the back of their minds, they couldn't help but wonder how much power Karen still had within the HOA. Would the investigation be thorough? Would the board stand up to her? Or would she find a way to twist the situation in her favor? As the days passed, Maria kept her phone close, constantly checking for updates, but none came. And then, one afternoon, a call came in. It was from the HOA. David answered, his heart racing as he listened intently. Maria stood beside him, her hand gripping his tightly, the tension between them palpable. After a few moments, David put the phone down and turned to face Maria, his expression unreadable. "They've called a special meeting," he said quietly. "It's happening tomorrow. They want us to come in, bring everything we have. This is it." Maria felt her breath catch in her chest. This was the moment of truth. It would either end in justice or in more of the same, the board covering for Karen, letting her get away with her actions, and forcing them back into silence. But they had come this far. They couldn't back down now. They couldn't let Karen get away with what she had done to their daughter, to their family. The next day, Maria and David arrived at the HOA office, feeling a mixture of apprehension and determination. They weren't alone. Other neighbors had shown up to support them, some who had witnessed Karen's behavior firsthand, others who had heard about it from the family. Maria was overwhelmed with gratitude for their courage, but the thought of facing Karen again made her stomach churn. The thought of what had happened to Madison still burned in her mind. She could never forget the fear in her daughter's eyes as Karen locked her away, as if she were nothing more than a nuisance to be disposed of. The meeting room was full when they entered. The board members sat at the front, and Karen was there too, sitting silently in the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She gave them a cold, calculating stare, but Maria refused to let it affect her. This wasn't Karen's fight anymore. It was their fight. David took the lead again, presenting the evidence they had gathered, witness testimonies from neighbors, the timeline of Karen's escalating actions, and the letter that had originally started it all. They had it all. They had proof that Karen had been using her power to intimidate, harass, and control others, and that she had crossed the line with her treatment of Madison. David spoke with a calm authority, outlining the damage Karen had caused to their family, making it clear that it wasn't just about the shoes or the garage. It was about a pattern of behavior that had finally gone too far. When David finished, Maria stood up. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She knew this was her moment. She couldn't hold back anymore. The anger, the hurt, everything she had been carrying since that day in the garage, it all came flooding to the surface. "Karen," Maria began, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "you have been tearing apart this community for far too long. You think you can hide behind your rules, behind your position in the HOA, but today it ends. You have no right to treat people the way you have, especially not my daughter." Karen shifted in her seat, her face hardening, but Maria wasn't done. "My daughter, Madison, deserves respect. She deserves to feel safe in her own home, just like everyone else here. But you," Karen took that away from her. "You locked her in a garage because of a stupid rule about shoes. You treated her like she was a criminal, and for what? Because she wasn't perfect enough for your standards? You tried to break us, Karen, but you didn't. We're standing here right now because we're stronger than you." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Maria could feel the eyes of the board members on her, but she didn't falter. Karen tried to speak, but Maria cut her off before she could get a word in. "You've hurt us. You've hurt this community," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. "And you need to be held accountable for what you've done. The only thing that matters now is that you understand that your actions have consequences." Finally, one of the board members, a woman in her early 50s, spoke up. "We've heard the evidence," she said, her voice firm and measured, "and we take this matter seriously. Karen, the board has decided to suspend you from your position effective immediately. We will also be conducting a full review of the HOA's practices, as we have seen a pattern of overreach and misuse of power in your actions." A wave of relief washed over Maria and David, but the battle wasn't completely over. Karen's face turned bright red with fury, but she remained silent, unable to argue against the weight of the evidence. The board had made their decision, and it was clear that Karen's time of controlling the neighborhood was up. Karen stood up, her hands trembling with anger, and stormed out of the room, but Maria could see the cracks in her facade. This wasn't the victory Karen had expected. For once, the power she had wielded for so long had slipped from her grasp. As the meeting ended, the board members voiced their support for the family, offering apologies for not intervening sooner. Maria and David exchanged a look of relief, but they both knew that this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about ensuring that their daughter could grow up in a world where she wouldn't be judged for who she was. It was about showing her that no matter how hard things got, they would always fight for her. The HOA had taken action, but the real victory lay in the strength of their family. They had stood up together and refused to let Karen or anyone else break them. They had won, but more importantly, they had shown Madison what it meant to be strong, to fight for what's right, and to never let anyone take away her dignity. It was a lesson they would carry with them forever. In the days following the showdown with Karen, Maria and David felt a quiet sense of victory settle over their family. The dust had not yet completely settled, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had gripped their home for so long had begun to ease, and the oppressive weight of fear had finally lifted. Karen had been removed from her position in the HOA, and the board had promised to overhaul the neighborhood's policies, ensuring that no one would be subjected to the kind of treatment that Madison had endured. For the first time in weeks, Madison seemed to breathe easier. Her smile returned, though it was still tinged with the memory of everything she had been through. She no longer looked over her shoulder when playing outside. There were no more anxious glances at the windows or the doors, wondering when Karen would appear again, ready to pounce with her demands. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Maria and David had been prepared for the aftermath, the backlash, the whispers, the resentment that might simmer beneath the surface. But as they returned to their daily routine, they were surprised to find that the community had largely rallied behind them. The neighbors who had once whispered in hushed tones about the HOA's overreach were now speaking openly, sharing their own experiences with Karen's control and her toxic influence. Many had quietly supported Maria and David, but it was clear now that their actions had sparked a much-needed change. Still, the relief was bittersweet. There were scars left behind. The emotional toll on Madison had been significant. She had never fully understood why Karen had targeted her, why she had been punished for something as trivial as shoes. But now, at least, she could begin to heal, knowing that her parents had fought fiercely for her. Maria and David knew, however, that the trauma would stay with her for a long time. They couldn't erase what had happened, but they could help Madison move forward, one day at a time. Maria spent time talking with her daughter, reassuring her that she was safe now. They had always tried to provide Madison with a sense of security, but the experience had shaken them all. Now, as they sat together in the living room, Maria held Madison's hand, looking into her eyes with love and promise. "We're free now, Madison," Maria said softly. "You don't have to worry about Karen or anyone else trying to hurt you. We'll always protect you. No one can ever take that away." Madison smiled up at her mother, a small but genuine smile. "I know, Mom," she said, her voice filled with an innocence that was slowly returning. "I feel better now." It was a slow process, but Madison was starting to regain her confidence. She returned to playing outside, though this time it was with a newfound sense of peace. The neighborhood had begun to feel like home again, quiet, safe, and full of the simple joys that had once seemed so distant. But even as the family began to heal, Maria and David knew that they had to remain vigilant. The battle with Karen might have been won, but the fight for fairness and respect for Madison, and for others like her, was ongoing. The HOA had promised changes, but it was up to the community to hold them accountable to make sure that this kind of behavior was never tolerated again. They organized a meeting with the new HOA leadership, advocating for the inclusion of clearer policies that protected residents, especially those with disabilities, from discrimination. Maria spoke passionately, and David backed her up, each of them reminding the board that their actions had consequences, both for the individuals directly affected and for the entire community. "We want to make sure that everyone in this neighborhood, regardless of their background or their differences, feels safe and valued," Maria said during the meeting. "This isn't just about us. It's about ensuring that every family, every person, is treated with dignity and respect." The new board members listened intently, and Maria and David's efforts began to shape the future of the community. By the time the meeting ended, the board had agreed to initiate a review of the HOA's bylaws and introduce new, more inclusive measures. They would no longer allow personal vendettas or petty grievances to define how the neighborhood functioned. For the first time in a long while, Maria and David felt a sense of accomplishment, not just for themselves, but for everyone in their community. And then, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The next week, Madison received a letter from the HOA. It was an official apology for the actions that had been taken against her. The letter acknowledged that the treatment she had received was wrong, and that the HOA deeply regretted the pain it had caused. For Maria, it was a moment of validation, a moment where all their struggles had paid off. They hadn't just fought for their daughter's freedom, they had fought for what was right. In the days that followed, Maria and David spent more time reflecting on the journey they had taken together. What had started as a simple desire to protect their daughter had turned into something much bigger, something that had changed the very fabric of their neighborhood. They had challenged a system of control and manipulation, and through their perseverance, they had won. As they sat on the porch one evening, watching Madison play with her friends, Maria and David exchanged a look of quiet pride. They had faced something far more difficult than they had ever imagined. But in the end, they had triumphed. They had shown Madison what it meant to fight for what was right, and they had done it together. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but Maria and David knew that no matter what came their way, they would always stand strong for their daughter. The lessons they had learned through this ordeal would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And as for Madison, she would grow up knowing that her parents would always have her back, no matter the challenge. The storm had passed, and now they could finally begin to rebuild, stronger than ever. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories just like this. Join us at HOA Denied Access, where we stand up for what's right and fight for justice. Stay tuned for more.